Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen made a visit to Ukraine, reaffirming the U.S.'s support for the war-torn country.
Rising Monday co-host Batya Ungar-Sargon tweeted, "At a time of record inflation, when American families are hurting and working-class Americans make less than they did in the 1970s, our Secretary of Treasury flies to another country to announce it is those people who deserve America's unyielding support." Here to discuss is Town Hall Managing Editor Spencer Brown. Welcome, Spencer. Good to have you with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, talk to us a little bit about where you think conservatives in particular are at the war in Ukraine. We've been looking at polling. I've been trying to judge whether support among actual Americans is as high for continued and endless involvement as it seems to be among our elite class, certainly among the Biden administration. But Republicans in Congress have been scuffling about this. The Kevin McCarthy confirmation hinged on that. What are they missing that you think actual voters are feeling?
Well, there's sort of two issues to look at here. And the first is the optics of this, which is sort of what was hinted at in that tweet. And that is, look at what's going on in the country right now. We've got inflation is through the roof. Americans' real wages are down 2-3% some months. You have the response, or lack thereof, to the toxic train disaster in Ohio going on. That's on the heels of the formula shortage and all this stuff where Americans feel like the federal government, the Biden administration, is not doing enough to take care of them right now here at home. Then you look at sort of the actual policy as it's being implemented, and there are more issues at play there with transparency. You have House Oversight Republicans now saying they're going to investigate sort of where all this money has gone and if it's being used fraudulently. And so those two things kind of bring together the two parts of sort of conservatives or the Republican Party right now, because it looks bad for sort of the red meat conservatives. Or they're like, are you kidding me? Look at this. We've got trains derailing. You're not doing anything. Pete Buttigieg didn't go. He didn't go for a while. Biden says he's not even going to go. That's bad. But then you have sort of the fiscal conservatives looking at the policy at this, saying we're just throwing money at the situation. How do we know it's going to work? And there are some sort of lines being drawn to what happened in Afghanistan, where we were saying, it's not going to fall to the Taliban. It's going to be fine. We can support them. We provided them all this training, all this aid.
And then look what happened.
Look what happened. It clearly did not work out. So is that what's going to happen here? And are we just throwing more money and resources at something that's going to have the same outcome?
Yeah, what's so interesting about some of this discourse, which I've appreciated, right? I wish there were more energy coming from the left flank in terms of anti-war movements. For whatever reason, there seems to be more energy on the right than there is right now than the left. Although there is some, obviously, we just had the Rage Against the War protest that was a bipartisan effort, 2 weekends ago now? Mm-hmm. That being said, as much as there is concern over Ukraine because it reflects an inattention to domestic issues, do you think there's going to be an actual robust conversation about using money, which we obviously have no issue using on Ukraine, to actually fund some of the infrastructure projects and the like that would help people like the ones in East Palestine, but which historically, in very recent history, Republicans have fought tooth and nail?
Yeah, I think that's interesting because look at how the battle played out over the infrastructure bill that President Biden eventually finally did get passed by Congress, which probably should have been easier to get through than it was given Democrats control both chambers. But you look at the reaction to that, and I think you do see an issue where they don't want the money spent overseas, but they also don't want it spent here at home, because that usually, if you look at what the Biden administration has done so far, all the spending they have done has just created inflation and no sort of significant improvement to their lives that they see here, right? So if the money had been spent on infrastructure and trains weren't derailing seemingly all the time, there was kind of that week of increased awareness of all the trains derailing.
There's been 1,000 in the last year.
Right, and so
Buttigieg used that as an excuse.
For why
you shouldn't care about it. It happens all the time.
Literally all the time. But I think that's the issue is Americans aren't expecting to see the effect in Ukraine necessarily of the money going there, apart from, the war continuing to go, Ukraine being able to fight. But they do expect if you're going to take their tax dollars and as a result the economy gets worse here, they want to see some sort of actual improvement to their lives. Build Back Better was sold as this thing that was going to fix the country and we were going to build back better than we were before the pandemic, before the Trump policies took effect, and we're just not seeing that, right? Because inflation's higher, gas prices spiked last summer. It's like they need to see something.
Let's break down some of that. So for one, the contention that an infrastructure policy that's supposed to address decades of neglect to our highways, roads, bridges, et cetera, that was implemented last year should have manifested in there being all of these massive changes to the infrastructure in a 6-month period, I think is a little unrealistic. Mm-hmm. But I want to come back to this claim about inflation. can it both be true that you are arguing that, not you personally, but Republicans are arguing that money being spent over in Ukraine is being ill spent, and that you're making this direct contrast with a failure to spend on domestic issues at the same time that you're arguing if you do spend on domestic issues, there is inflation? It seems to me the left's argument here is much more sound, to say that we actually look to different causes for inflation. Inflation is happening in discrete industries. Inflation is just the cost of goods going up, right? So if you ask why the cost of education is going up, these are the 4 leading industries sectors where there's inflation: education, food, transportation, and healthcare. If you look at those 4 sectors, why is healthcare costs going up? Is it because of COVID spending, or have healthcare costs been high for decades, half a century, and is the United States paying more for healthcare per person than any other comparable country in the world, and why? Is it really because of spending, or is it because we have this privatized healthcare system that is earning so much profit? Education costs, is it because something happened with spending? Was there something in the COVID bill about spending? Or are healthcare costs up because of these federally backed loans that have been existing for decades, which have caused wickedly rising costs in the cost of education and all these other kinds of things, on and on and on. So can Republicans get a hold on this message? Are they just exploiting the domestic issues to argue against Ukraine? Or are they going to demonstrate a real investment in actually spending on the American people if we do stop spending on Ukraine?
Well, part of the problem is just because of how divided Washington is and how close the majorities are in both chambers. You've seen the House Conference Chair, Elise Stefanik, has introduced this Rein In Act that's targeting, bringing in the spending so that way we can maybe better spend it, is her idea. Is we need to reduce what's been just thrown out there, whether it was all the fraud and abuse and waste that happened with the COVID aid that went out, other things. They're trying to figure out kind of where the money went so we can get back what we can and not make that mistake again, with the supposed goal of then spending it more wisely and making sure that it's not used in such a way. I do think, though, that just on Capitol Hill, it never actually goes that far, because they're never going to find something that they can all agree to spend money on or in a certain way. And so your issue,
Except Ukraine.
Well, somewhat, yes. There is, depending on which members of Republican Party you ask.
But shouldn't infrastructure be exactly that? Wasn't the whole point of having an infrastructure bill as his central policy objective that everyone can agree about roads and bridges, and somehow that still became a political exercise?
Well, and especially given during the Trump administration, we had infrastructure week after week after week, where they were focused, they recognized that infrastructure was something that they needed to work on and that tax dollars should actually be put toward. And we saw, some success with the infrastructure projects that they did. Interestingly, Pete Buttigieg was just in Kansas City to open the new terminal at KCI, and that project was actually prioritized and partially funded by the Trump administration, even though Buttigieg was the one who got to go and, sort of cut the ribbon and open it up. So there were good spending projects that I think Republicans would agree with that happened during the Trump administration under Republican control of Congress. It's just when the shoe's on the other foot, as we've seen with any issue you want to put to it, when the Democrats are doing it, Republicans want to stop it, and it's kind of vice versa at the same time.
And the Republican commitment to reining in spending overall just rings so hollow because whenever they're in charge, they don't rein in.
It turns out politicians from both parties really love spending.
Yeah.
It's hard to believe.
How about
hard
that?
to believe.
But that's the thing. I mean, we joke about that as though that's a bad thing, but we elect people to figure out how to use tax dollars. And I know the MMT people are going to be mad at me. It's not really how the budget works. The U.S. budget does not work like a household budget. Yeah. They don't need to tax to spend. However, the whole point of us electing these officials is to figure out how to distribute resources in our society so that they make life better for the majority of Americans. For all Americans, hopefully, is the idea. So they're supposed to be spending. The whole point is they're supposed to be getting together and figuring out how to spend. They're not sitting there running a savings account for the United States of America, except to the extent that they're supposed to be making sure that Social Security remains solvent, which again is another thing that they could do if they decided to put their heads together and lift the artificial caps on taxing rich people to fund Social Security and other kinds of things like Bernie Sanders has proposed. That being the case, why, if there's this recognition between the three of us here, that there are shared goals even with respect to infrastructure, that there are shared goals with respect to some of these foreign policy objectives, that at the end of that right now we have in East Palestine Republicans arguing that there needed to be more regulations even. So some of the divide on the kind of the regulatory state is even collapsing in the face of a crisis like this. Why does this conversation, in your view, not translate into what ends up happening in Congress, and why aren't the people in the United States of America more concerned about that and hold their politicians responsible for the fact that they are not reflecting the broader interest as reflected at this table?
Well, I think earlier in your comment there, you talked about how the American people elect their representatives to go and spend money to make their lives better. And I think it goes back to what I had hinted at earlier, which is they are not seeing their life get any better right now because they have inflation, you have the supply chain crisis, the baby formula shortage, there's a myriad things happening where voters sitting at home are going, why does the government need more money? And so I think they do see it kind of like, if I give them money, they're going to spend it. Obviously, again, that's not exactly how it works, but they view it as, why should I pay more in taxes when I'm not getting any benefit? And so it's at that sort of very granular level of an individual thinking about how they feel about an issue. And Republicans have, for the large part, captured those people who say, no, the government at the federal level shouldn't have more money. It should be down to, state, local government, whatever it may be, to spend my money more wisely, to really throw it back to Republican Ronald Reagan. The whole idea that the clumsy, ineffective hand of government in Washington can decide how to spend the money that's earned and paid in taxes by local individuals, it doesn't work. And so obviously there are some situations with infrastructure spending, for example, where you need the larger hand of government to come in and prioritize projects and make sure that things like the interstates are working and our airports are safe. It just doesn't translate to so many of those other issues where Americans sitting at home see waste, they see fraud, they see things going downhill. And so they just don't want to invest more in something that they feel is broken. And it kind of gets to that whole idea of, it's a broken system, they don't want to throw money at it.
I think that analysis is correct in terms of what people feel. I think the missing part of it from a left perspective is, why is that system broken? And if we look at the East Palestine disaster and you see all of the lobbying dollars and millions of lobbying dollars that went to make sure that updated brake systems weren't implemented, that trains carrying toxic chemicals didn't have to follow the safety regulations that trains carrying oil had to follow, and that was a direct consequence of lobbyists spending money to pay politicians not to do the things that were in the interest of their constituents, then that's a big piece that has to be resolved as well.
Well, we'll have more Rising after this. Stay with us.